And then we'll get started. So thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Mark Driscoll. I am the program manager for the Preventative Health Program with the Ohio AAP. We have with us today also our medical director, Dr. Chris Bulling, as well as our speaker, Dr. Ben Carney. We can flip to the next slide. So today we'll be talking about understanding and representing the needs of children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The next slide. And our speaker today, Dr. Ben Carney, has no relevant financial relationship with ineligible companies to disclose. And then also the Ohio AAP is working very hard to make a more robust diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative within our chapter. So we've taken into account kind of a rubric that we've developed when we built out the slides for this program. But if you have any questions or suggestions for ways that we can improve our DE&I initiative, you can email our medical director, Dr. Chris Bowling, at that email address that you see on the screen. And I'll be sending out these slides later as well. And then with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Ben Carney has been working with families for over 40 years and as a licensed professional for over 35 years. Dr. Carney strongly believes that although science and the field have made significant progressive changes, the importance of recognizing relational connections continues to remain at the forefront of his work. Helping families and professionals recognize that relationships are paramount to our social, emotional, and physical health and well-being continues to be the mission that drives his work at the Family Institute of Ohio. So without further ado, Dr. Carney.
Well, good afternoon. Next slide. Before I start walking through these slides, I want you to know a couple of things. There's a lot of information here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm certainly not going to read them to you, but I do want them to be a resource. Secondly, one of the consequences or phenomenon of doing an online training is that I don't get to meet you personally, and you don't get to meet me personally, and we pay a lot of attention only to each other's faces. Since I can't see yours, you can see mine, and you see mine fairly closely. So I don't want to appear shifty. So let me explain why I look where I look. So if you see me do this, I'm looking at myself or someone on that board to get a sense of how I'm communicating or any responses from others. It does look like an unusual view. It looks like I'm looking out of the corner of my eye, and we don't like people who always look out of their corners of their eyes. So I can do this, but that's a little more obvious, a little less comfortable. So I'm not being shifty when I look out of the corner of my eye that way. When I look over here, I'm actually going to be reading some of my notes and making sure I've covered some topics that I want to cover. And then when I look up, I'm actually thinking about what I'm going to say. So to explain some of the micro movements that my face makes so that you don't find it extremely uncomfortable or disquieting is important to me. All right. So with that said, welcome to this noon and afternoon presentation looking at ADHD in kids. When we look at the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit, we look at different types. And I want to spend just a moment talking about the inattention type. However, I did want to mention that I may take time for questions at about halfway through. So if you send questions in, Mark will be able to read them to me, and I'll see if I have time to answer some. If not, I'll try to take some time at the end to answer questions as well. So the inattentive type is really a type that is where one has a real hardship around focusing. And you can see from this list of problems here, fails to give close attention to details, doesn't hold attention, doesn't always seem to listen when spoken to directly, avoids or dislikes in tasks that require sustained mental attention. This is really about attention. This type of ADHD is not as easily seen as the other types I'm going to mention. The reason it's not as easily seen is because it's not as visibly expressive. You have to watch the child who has this difficulty and see it. So when you're looking at a child with ADHD that's just inattentive, it may be less obvious and oftentimes missed or misunderstood. I'll talk more about the misunderstanding in a moment. Next slide. The other type is the hyperactivity impulsivity type. Now, this one, you almost always see it. This child runs like they're on a motor. They are moving. When you get them in if you're a clinician and you get them in your office space, they don't want to sit in the seat. Some of the best therapy I've done with a kid with ADHD is they're sitting with their head next to the floor and their feet on the back of the chair, because that's where they feel best. That's where they're trying to regulate best, and it gives them enough sensory activation for them to be able to talk to me. If I asked them to just sit there and sit quietly, I would get absolutely nothing from them because their bodies would be screaming to move. So this child fidgets, they get up, leave their seat. They're unable to just engage in real leisure activities quietly. And the motor metaphor I find very descriptive for these children. Next slide. So you can have the inattentive type, you can have the hyperactivity type, or you can have the combined type. And I'll talk a little bit more about how those roll out in gender in a moment. But what's really important from a criteria perspective in diagnosing is that the symptoms must be present before the age of 12. This is not something that happens during adolescence. I want to stress very strongly that this diagnosis is a neurobiological condition. This is not a psychological condition. It is a expressly neurobiological condition. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have psychological conditions that are comorbid with it and co-occurring, and you want to make sure that you've looked at or had somebody look at what possible co-occurring diagnoses could be with this, as well as what making sure that this is ADHD versus not a different disorder. So these symptoms not only have to be present before age 12, they have to be present in the home, work, more than one setting. So most of the time, these kids are going to have difficulties in school, but they'll also have difficulties at home. One of the things that we'll make sure when we talk about assessments is that you get information from 2 or more settings. It's not enough to make a diagnosis or to support a diagnosis when it's just a parent report or a teacher report. It needs to be both, and with as many teachers as you can, to make sure that it's across teachers. One of the challenges with ADHD is sometimes it's just aggravation from the parent or adult in the child's life, not knowing how to handle the behavior. And that's what you've got to make sure, that this is not just a simple behavioral challenge that is very concerning or aggravating to the adult, but that it's really a cross-setting phenomenon. And that's why you make sure we get information from more than one setting and as many settings as we possibly can. The other thing that when one makes this diagnosis, that it's really important to process what's going on affectively for the child. Many times, anxiety can present with the same difficulties in attention and motoring as ADHD. But when it's anxiety, it often doesn't happen across settings. You see it just within 1 or 2 key relationships and not present in all the settings in the child's life. And that's really important as well, because if it's a psychological problem, it's more specific and problematic in a certain domain or setting. If it's a neurobiological condition, it's going to be present across domains and problematic in those domains. And so therefore, we must have clear evidence that this is really interfering with the quality of social, academic, or occupational function. Next slide. I think what's really important is, as we recognize it as a neurobiological condition, that we start to see it as a problem that is not based in the child's mood, the child's sadness, the child's anxiety, but really is a core deficit in behavioral inhibition. And so I really like Russell Barkley's work on ADHD, and it starts to help us understand from a framework how to engage with it. So when we talk about behavioral intervention, I'm sorry, behavioral inhibition, we all have struggles with behavioral inhibition. Uh, None of us get on the interstate and drive the speed limit. Now that's interesting and ironic to me, because the term speed limit means there's nothing beyond that, because it is the limit. And you cannot go over the limit. According to the definition of speed limit at 70 is speed limit at 70. And yet almost none of us get on the interstate and drive 70. So therefore the question is, how fast do we go? And this is a question of behavioral inhibition. How comfortable am I at going over or beyond the behavioral expectations put on me? How much can I inhibit my behavior? Now, most of us, if the interstate were clear, most of us would drive maybe 10 miles an hour if we feel comfortable at 70 miles an hour. Would we feel comfortable at 80 miles an hour if there's nothing on the road? If there's nothing on the road, would we drive at 90 miles an hour? I don't know how. If we're a wide open track and we knew our car well, we might want to see what 100 miles an hour feels like. And so when we're on the interstate and the limit says 70, we have a conscious decision to make. How much over the speed limit are we going to go? And I'm one of those that just go 6, maybe 7 at the most over. I get on the interstate and set my cruise control. It's at 77 or 60 or 72, depending on the speed limit. And that's how fast I go, because I don't want the consequences. But there are people that drive way faster than that, and they pass me in the left lane. And there are people that are 72 and I pass them in the left lane. But if I really were just going to get on the interstate and drive 70, I would probably make a lot of people upset, because almost everybody has given in to their behavioral inhibition processes to drive faster than that. Well, we do that consciously. We decide how fast we're going to drive. A child dealing with this core deficit of behavioral inhibition doesn't have the conscious capacities to make the choices on all their behavioral inhibition challenges. And so they struggle with the ability to resist the urge to do something they either don't want to do or something that an adult doesn't want to do. When Barkley looks at this, he sees that there are 4 deficits that are in the executive functioning process. Now, the executive functioning process is this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that really makes us human and gives us a sense of goal-directedness. This part of the brain is especially sophisticated and has become very sophisticated over the last 200,000 years. And it became even more sophisticated over the last 100,000 years when we developed language. And then about 40,000 years ago, we became very sophisticated in creative goal processes. And so when we developed art and music and religion in our evolutionary development, these executive functions played an important role in how we see ourselves. There are 4 components of these functions. The working memory, which allows us to hold information in our minds to complete tasks. So if I asked you to say the following numbers, I want you to remember the following numbers: 9, 7, 3, 6, 1, and then say them backwards. All right. As you say them backwards, I've already lost them because my mind's doing something else. But whatever those 5 numbers were, as you say them backwards to yourself, that is a working memory process. And if you were able to successfully do it, your brain shifted into a working memory process and said, all right, I heard him say these 5 numbers, and now I'm going to inverse them. Saying them in reverse is a more complicated working memory task than just saying them forward, because that's the same way you heard them, and it's easier to say something sequentially when you've heard it than it is to hold them in your mind and turn them around. So that's an example of working memory. When we look at emotional self-regulation, I think this one's fairly clear. we have to not give in to our emotions. And this relates highly to behavioral inhibition, especially for children with ADHD. They really struggle with this self-regulation process because it just feels so good to let that energy out. The left prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's right here, is really responsible for inhibition, and this part has really been seen to play a significant role in this emotional regulation and inhibition process. The next component for this is Russell Barkley is this internalization of speech. You'll see children develop this typically. They start without the capacity until about age 3 or 4 to really talk and guide what they're actually doing. And it starts, as it starts at those early ages, it's a verbalization process. They actually talk to themselves. I'm doing this and I'm doing that, and I want to do this and I want to do that. Well, that eventually becomes internal, and then it becomes both internal with words and internal with images. So if I say to you, what are you going to be doing this evening? You will think about what it is you're going to do, and you'll actually get like a comic book process where you get an image of what you're going to do, and then the words that narrate to yourself what it is that you're going to do. And so you get both an imagistic process and a verbal process. That's where the left and the right hemisphere become coordinated and share with you what it is that you're going to do. Well, children with attention deficit, because it's a more complex working memory process, have struggles with holding on to the images and the verbalizations at the same time. They get confused, it gets frustrating, and you can see if your working memory is not as strong as it needs to be, then you've got 5 things you want to do tonight, and you've got the images coming in, and then you have the words coming in, and then you have to put those all together in some sequential process. And that starts to be, you can see how difficult that can be, and that could break down the process of what you're going to do. As you put all of those things together, that becomes reconstitution. As you think about what you're going to do tonight and how you've transitioned from doing what you're doing today to what you're doing tonight and what you're going to do tomorrow, you start to get a global picture of your plan. And so you start to reconstitute all those pieces that are floating out there, and you assemble it in a process that delivers a future state from a current state. One of the primary processes of the brain, actually the default state of the brain, is a future state process. We're always wondering about what's next. It's one of the reasons why we as mammals worry so much. And dogs have a future state too. That's why they sit out there and look at the window and watch everybody go by. They're looking at a future state. Wonder what's going to happen next. Wonder what's going to happen next. Wonder what's going to happen next. Well, in humans, our future state process is much more sophisticated. And we are aware that negative things can happen. And so we tend to be future state oriented to positive or negative valences. And so when we are future stating a positive valence, we're filled with hope and all right, we're excited. And when we're in a future state filled with worry or negativeness, we worry. We go, oh God, how am I going to handle this? And so reconstitution is a really important process as we prepare for either what we hope to do or what we worry about not doing or worry that won't happen to us. And yet, when someone has attention deficit, they struggle with being able to reconstitute or plan for the future. And so anxiety is oftentimes a secondary condition of attention deficit. I'll talk about those in a moment, more about that in a moment as well. So it's important to see that attention deficit is a performance deficit. This is not a psychological challenge. By that, I mean it's not an emotional process. It can have co-occurring emotional processes, but in it itself is a neurobiological condition. Next page, please. So if we're really going to work on improving reconstitution capacity, we have to build the capacities of planning, problem solving, and generativity, which means we take what we've done and we're able to do it again and again. If you were taking a trip to Europe, what processes would you plan for? What problem-solving skills would you bring? And how would you know that if you've prepared well for a previous trip, that you can apply those rules or those experiences to this trip? And so that's an example of reconstitution. You do the same thing if you're going to serve a large meal to 10 people. You go through the planning process, you identify possible problem-solving processes, and you look at the previous things that you've done, maybe things that other people have done, and you bring all those things together into an approach that allows you to solve the situation that you're facing. Children with attention deficit have difficulties in these areas. Next page. When we look at ADHD and we look at kids, it's important to recognize that there are some differences based on sex. Boys are more apt to have a diagnosis of ADHD, around 3 times higher than girls. Girls tend to have the ADHD diagnosis around inattentive types, and boys tend to have it around either a combined type or the hyperactivity impulsive type. There's possibilities for this that are both neurobiological and sociological. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but what's really important is that since the inattentive subtype, you have to look for. If you don't look for it, it can be missed. Next page. So biology plays a role with how ADHD is presented across sex. Testosterone may play a role in it. Testosterone in utero may play a role in it. What's probably another significant contributor is that in males, the corpus callosum is thinner and grayer. Corpus callosum is the bridge that connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain. And if you remember, I said the inhibition is in the left prefrontal cortex. It's right here. Yet the whole prefrontal cortex is working on these executive functioning processes. And so if the bridge between the 2 hemispheres isn't as strong as it could be, and there's a problem in this inhibition process, the other side of the brain, the other side of the prefrontal cortex can't compensate as well for the inhibition tendencies. And so that may be part of the explanation of why boys they have more problems with inhibition and doing behaviors that are more problematic, whereas girls, because their corpus callosum is better myelinated and grayer, which means it's got greater density of these fibers. So it's actually whiter, so it's denser. The right hemisphere and the left hemisphere compensate for each other, especially around disinhibition. The other thing is that, of course, socialization can play a role. We tolerate as a culture boys' activities, and girls get a social pressure message to settle down, and that may be also playing a role in girls' capacity to inhibit behavior and why it only comes up as attention processes. All right. What's the key takeaway there is, look, when you see girls struggling, pay attention to the inattentive type or you'll miss it. And it can be misdiagnosed as anxiety or depression. And it may eventually be that, but initially it may just be that she's having real struggle with attention and maybe ADHD and attentive type. Next slide. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on the stimulants. I've given you just a little bit information around it. You can come back and learn more about this. Most kids the plurality of children are prescribed either Ritalin or Adderall, and this has pretty strong effective ranges when you look at how it impacts kids. This is also part of the confirmation that it's really neurobiological. That because these things work well, and we've got a very long history of stimulants working with this medication. We've got 50 to 60 years of scientific evidence around the effectiveness of these medications. I talk here a little bit about what they do, that focus really especially on dopamine and norepinephrine. And, you know, sometimes we just get worried about using stimulants to address problems of attention. But I don't know about you, but I start every day with a couple cups of coffee. And what does that do? That really just impacts the levels of dopamine in my prefrontal cortex. So, it's pretty effective. It helps. I'm a little crankier and a little more agitated in the morning if I don't get coffee. So, next slide. Here are a couple of other processes for medication that are not as typical. So you've got the selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, and Strattera is the one that's the most common there. And then if they go a different route, if the prescriber goes a different route, they may use Wellbutrin because that's also impacting the receptor sites as well for those neurotransmitters. And if there's tics, then there are a couple of other medications that can be useful to manage ADHD. Next slide. What I really wanted to spend some time with is on this slide. As you're going to be supporting somebody who may be receiving treatment for ADHD, it's really important to understand the side effects. Especially reduced appetite is one that's really important. Kids sometimes who have sensory motoring problems also have problems with tolerating taste and touch. They don't like their collars on their neck. They don't like how certain things feel in their mouth. They may not like, for example, noodles because they're too squishy. And so they have a limited range of food they eat. And what you've got to be careful with a child that has those sensory symptoms, that if you give them something that's going to reduce their appetite when their appetite already was relatively poor, you're going to have an effect on their weight. And so knowing what's going on with how much they're eating is an important part of a supportive role when you help work with kids like this. Trouble sleeping can also occur. Stomach aches, they normally go away. There's other medications that can help. Headaches, not an uncommon side effect initially. Anxiety and jitteriness, they can occur, especially at higher dosages. It's also valuable to talk to the children about the difference between being jittery and being anxious. So anxiety is tied to a thought, and the thought is a worry. So if you can help them recognize the link between the anxiety and the thought and the worry and see if it's really happening, or is it just a motor agitation, or, for example, a jitteriness? They just feel it in their bodies, but they don't really have anything going on in their mind. Well, that helps them separate the symptoms, the side effects from really the feelings that they're truly dealing with. If it's just jitteriness, that you can wait out, that you can work an extinction process with, or that you can address with some of the other things that I'll talk about in a moment. But that doesn't have an affective mood state behind it triggered by thoughts, whereas anxiety. Mood swings can happen. That often is when a child doesn't recognize why the jitteriness is there, and then feels like this is a mood state and then can't respond. There are rebounding effects. After you come off of it, you can feel more tired. Of course, you get increased heart rate and blood pressure, slightly increased, and you can get an increase in tics. They don't cause new ones normally. And if you do so, please make sure you talk with the pediatrician or the psychiatrist if you see those. All right, next slide. All right, before we get into this level, I didn't know if there were questions that I should take, Mark, anything that has popped up.
Don't have any in the chat box, but if anybody has questions, feel free to either unmute or enter your questions in the chat box.
Just a minute.
Ben, this is
Yes.
Chris Bowling. I have a quick question for you, actually. Sometimes in practice, we will get those adolescents who actually will hit like an academic milestone. Like, they've always been a little bit ADHD. They've always had some symptomatology, but have been able to manage it from behavioral perspectives. Do you think yeah, I mean, that seemed to be something that we would see periodically in practice. Do you see that also? Like, just like I always think about like those kids that did fine until they hit these really abstract things like economics or philosophy almost.
Well, I can see it when they shift into algebra or
Mhm.
into additional languages. So and that can be a time where they just don't quite have the skills, and so we work through the skills, and if the skills aren't adequate, because they may have the intellectual capacities to work with those struggles from a memory process. So, for example, a story is not a real complex working memory function. So you can write, you can put a story together, you can remember the story because the story itself is a crutch or a support to the working memory process as it moves through the recollection. And so remembering what happened to a story is probably not as cognitively challenging as learning a new language because there aren't very many crutches available for learning a new language. And so that's when the insufficiency of attention shows up or becomes or crosses the threshold. And so, yes, I do think that academically children can reach a point where they they don't have their resources are tapped, and either other skills or medication may be helpful at that point. Was there another
Thank
question,
you.
Mark? Thought I saw something pop up in the chat. I didn't know.
Oh, yes, we have. I see this with switching to multiple teachers and parents are helping them stay organized as much. Also, when some go off to college and lost the structure of home, then the ADHD symptoms come out. It's as if their intelligence and support from home masked the ADHD.
Sure.
More of a state.
Well, yeah, or just adequately supports it, as the writer said, and the supports dissipate, and so the inadequacies and insufficiencies show up. Absolutely. Okay. When we think about treatment, there are a number of approaches that I believe should be the focus. And I'm going to talk about one in a little bit more detail because I really like it a lot. But parent management training is really important. One of the struggles, though, is that oftentimes when you're working with a child with attention deficit, there is an inherited component to it. And so one or both parents may have someone in their lives that has attention deficit. And they may either struggle with it themselves or carry some agitation from watching somebody else struggle inadequately with it. And so it's really important that we help parents understand their role. There's some really good guidelines out there, some really good books on how to help parents do it. And it really, the goal is to coach parents into accepting that this is a neurobiological condition and not just a condition of will. Um, I've had parents go, look, we're both Ivy League parent trained kids, trained adults. We went to school. Why can't this kid do this? So, you know, we're really bright. He's really bright. He just doesn't want to. So he's just really mad at us. Well, it was more complex than that. So, helping parents recognizing their role as coach is vital. Shifting the behavior pattern of one who determines the winner or the loser. Sometimes as parents, we just like to be judged. You did a good job, you win. You didn't do a good job, you got second place or third place. We sit at the end of the line and we judge our children for their performance. And sometimes that's necessary. But most of the time, it's much more important that we take on the role of coach. And we look at how we can help our children develop better skills. And so it's a shift for parents. Instead of being evaluative, it requires one to be facilitative. Cognitive behavioral therapy is also a component of treatment. Now, it's not an extremely important component of treatment, but it should be included. Children with attention deficit have a high risk for comorbidity with oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. And you can imagine what it's like for a child of 12 who has always struggled with sitting still, with focusing, following directions, transitioning from video game to getting ready for school, all those things that are really undermined by a poor disinhibition process, and being told, what's wrong with you? Why can't you figure this out? I could do it when I was your age. Why can't you? These messages that come from the environment, whether they be from any level of adult. They don't have to be just from parents, but they can come from any level of adult interacting with the child. Can send these insufficient, inadequate messages to the child that start to really impact the child's sense of self. And I'm not just talking about self-esteem here. I'm talking about self-efficacy. One of the core strengths for resiliency is self-efficacy. I can get done what I need to get done. I can handle what I need to handle. Self-esteem is a little more nebulous than that. You can have high self-esteem and low self-efficacy, which doesn't always make a lot of sense. That's why self-efficacy needs to be the focus. But children with attention deficit often deal with poor levels of self-efficacy. Why can't I? I try. Why can't I do this? Why can't I get this done? There's something wrong with me. And as they internalize both their self messages and the message they may get from adults who are being more judgmental than coaching, it starts to really impact their sense of self. And you can see why they would become oppositional, why they would say, leave me alone, get away from me. I'm no good. I don't like you. I don't like me. And so when we think about treatment, that's the component around cognitive behavioral therapy that is impactful. When we start to get into their beliefs about themselves and recognizing the feelings around those beliefs that happen over a pattern of time. So that's where that self-identification of efficacy is where cognitive behavioral therapy is useful. Of course, classroom accommodations are important and organizing skills are vital. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Don't forget the need for exercise, being out in green space as well. It resets the brain. So children that have hypermotoring processes will do well when they're tired. They can attend and focus a little bit better when they've got that energy out. So that's a good process. It's also really helpful to do mindfulness and meditation. Occupational therapy referrals are really important for children as well. Allowing them to become mindful of their processes of watching thoughts go through their brain, watching feelings go through their bodies, and doing a lot of body awareness processes. It's funny to watch a kid with attention deficit try to do the mirror process where he just mirrors the therapist. They really they have to do it very slowly and very carefully, and you have to use a lot of positive reinforcement to help them mirror accurately, because they think they're finished and they've mirrored it correctly when they've missed things because they're not paying attention. So it's a good exercise that builds skill-based capacities and can be a little bit of fun. But don't fail to use these assistive technologies, timers, planners. One of the most important things for kids with attention deficit are signs. Because it's a working memory process, they can't hold the message in their mind. So you put signs, and you put signs with words and with signs with emblems up, so that they can not only read the words, but they can follow the picture and what it says as well. And by doing so, it doesn't make them have to remember the steps. Even something as simple as getting ready for bed, there's 4 or 5 steps in that. And by the time, they're brushing their teeth, they've forgotten the 2 other ones, and they spend a lot of time just brushing their teeth and playing with their toothbrush. And then they climb into bed and they've missed the other 2 things that you wanted them to do. So that's why it's really important to use assistive technology. If you can put their mind on the wall, do so. So if you can put it in words and pictures on the wall that they can see, that's what their mind needs. So, okay. Now let me talk a little bit about collaborative and proactive solutions. Ross Green, he's just marvelous at this, has been working with difficult children for since the 80s. I think I read his first book in, I'm going to say 90 something. And he's got a number of them. He has a website. You can Google Ross Green and it'll come up, or you can Google Lives in the Balance and it'll come up. And he has given all of these interventions for free. You can go and be trained by him in Maine. We've had him here in Ohio a few years ago, but he is very approachable, and it's a great resource for parents, and it's a great resource for people who work with kids with ADHD. His major motto is kids do well if they can. And his attempt is to set upside down the concept of oppositional kids, and kids that are just willfully doing things against parents' will. And so since ADHD kids are often seen as this because they have challenging behavior, this approach is very helpful. This is probably my go-to approach when I'm working with parents and kids with ADHD. Ross has a simple approach, and in the second box, there's a series of questionnaires that you can find, and it really helps you identify the problem, that's the skill that's missing. And so what are the unsolved problems that the client is having? What is he or she not being able to do? Not what is she doing or he doing that's so problematic, but what does he want to do that he can't do? And so this really focuses on skills. It does not look at blame. And he talks a lot about lagging skills. You've got them, you've got these skills, but they're just a little bit behind. And what can we do to develop them? The one strength in this approach is that you must simplify the skill that you're going to work on, and you work on one skill at a time. You don't, for example, being late. That's not a skill that we're going to work on. All right. Getting to school by 7:45 is the skill we're going to work on. Being late, he might be late to a party, he might be late to church, he might be late to wherever his parents want to go out for dinner. And if we start trying to figure out what's going on in all those situations and have this child master them, we're never going to generalize the skill base, because it's different. The skills requirement may be different for certain situations. And so really walk this through based on a specific behavior that is being presented as the problem, and then you work on solving that behavior. And so, what does it mean to help a child get to school at 7:45? Well, you map that whole process out. It means he has to be in the car by 7:35. Then what does he have to do to be in the car? He has to be had breakfast, has to be at the breakfast table by this time. And then what time does he have to be in the shower? And what time does he have to be out of bed? And how does he, what actions need to take place that he can accept getting out of bed at this amount of time? And so, how much work is it a problem to get out of bed and get into the shower? Does that happen automatically? Does it happen automatically to go for the shower to the kitchen table? All right, well, then we're not going to work on those skills. Those skills are present. What is the skill that is specifically missing? And sometimes it's just getting out of bed at 6:30. What's necessary? What supports does he need? What supports does he need from his parents? And what supports does he have to accept and work on acceptance? And so you get that behavior that well defined, and then from that you drive whether it drives success or not. And then if it doesn't, you rework your approach, but you do it a behavior at a time. This in itself starts to get to generativity. When a child recognizes that he's been able to successfully do one goal, all right, then what's the next goal? So when a parent comes to me and they're talking about, well, my child's doing poorly at school, I don't create a plan for everything, right? We start with what's the most important thing, and they normally identify homework. And so what does it take to initiate homework? Right? Is it initiation homework, or does he not finish it? Does he stop in the middle? And you break it out in that way, and then that starts to drive where you're going to do the work. After we've built competency on homework, then it becomes, can we repeat this? And what's necessary to have this process be generalized? And then once we're done with homework, then we start maybe to studying for tests. But you can imagine if we started all of this at once, it would be overwhelming both to the parent, to the teacher, or to the kid. And so we don't. And so it's a simple skill development process that's focused on a collaborative problem solving technique. Everybody works together, and the blame is not the focus. The focus is skill development, and therefore it's both proactive and strength-based. I encourage you, if you're engaged with helping families deal with attention deficit, that you really look up Collaborative and Proactive Solutions by Ross Green at Kids Lives in the Balance. Next slide. These are things that can be done also at the school. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but many schools across the country have been involved with collaborative and proactive solutions, and have well-designed and well-developed approaches. Other schools don't use collaborative and proactive solutions, but teachers themselves do. So you can always recommend the site to teachers. Next page. Okay, I'm going to go a little bit more quickly for the next 5 or 7 minutes, just to hit these things at a high scale, at a high level. So 30,000 feet. There are a number of ADHD screens that are used as assessment tools. They are helpful. They are not diagnostic in a month themselves. So while the child behavior checklist can be, the Vanderbilt is really part of an assessment. And Connors is part of an assessment as well. So these are screens, and some are assessment tools that can make a diagnosis, but most are not, and most are really very informative to those who are making a diagnosis. I think the one that you'll see most common is the Vanderbilt. You also see the SNAP-4. They're both very similar in that they get a lot of information from a number of areas, and that help the assessor make the diagnosis. Again, the diagnosis should not be made only on the report of an instrument. Next page. Educational support is really important. The earlier we can recognize the challenges and struggles, the more quickly we can get the brain to adapt Brains adapt better at younger ages than they do at older ages. And so the sooner we can get supportive processes in place, the better. Schools often will change some of their structure, their organization. They'll get into movements. They'll try to reduce distractions. They'll use assistive technology. I know kids who just love fidget tools, so it really helps them. And then positive reinforcement. I wanted to say a moment about negative reinforcement and punishment. They don't tend to work. If spanking worked, we'd have only ever been spanked once in our lives. And that's not true. So it just doesn't work. So we really got to find a way to use positive reinforcement to catch them doing well, knowing that they want to do well, because as Ross Green says, kids will do well if they can. Next page. There are a lot of things that schools can do, but really encourage them to focus on strengths and take extra time for these kids. Next page. So one of the things that you may be exposed to, or you may help parents respond to, is the need for additional supports for their children. And the way this starts is the child and the parent have to complete a multifactorial evaluation. Now, you may not hear that term a lot. You may just hear an evaluation, but the legal rule is multifactorial evaluation. You find that in certain rules. But parents can request at any time an evaluation for their child, and there will be an evaluation team report produced by the school. When they've completed that evaluation, you may get an individualized education plan, or you may get a Section 504 plan. The IEP is really for children who need special education services. And so that is a much higher level of academic support, academic involvement around their special needs. It's not uncommon that this happens for kids that are on the spectrum, and kids with severe ADHD sometimes will also qualify for an IEP. Most often, my experience has been that kids with attention deficit get a 504 plan. They don't require the special education services that are provided for children with deeper-ended difficulties. But they do need accommodation to assess general education. And so these are designed to provide equal access to the curriculum and opportunities. It's just a less formal end product than the IEP, but it's still facilitated by at least some level of an evaluation team assessment and report. Next slide. To be eligible for a 504 plan, there has to be some level of disability according to the idea, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And so you can get anxiety, and depression can help produce a 504 plan. And again, remember, with kids with anxiety and depression, sometimes they have the attention problems that are present in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it's not tied to that neurobiological process. It's more of a psychological process. Then there's needs for accommodation and additional times on tests, better seating, note taking. They sometimes take tests outside of the classroom. I know with the state test that just took place, some children on a 504 plan, they take their test away from other kids, and they have different time constraints. So these are things that allow them to deal with their difficulties and struggles, and not have to be negatively consequenced for them. Next slide. When we work with parents, I just want to encourage you. We have to be gentle with parents as well. We have to help them gently move from sometimes being judgmental to sometimes being coaching. But almost always when I work with parents, their frustration comes from their pain and their hurt. And so if we can recognize their pain, their hurt, their fear, they don't know how to get there. When the parents presented to me, oh, I've got, we're both Ivy League, and why are we having this child? It wasn't that they were being mean or harsh. They were scared. They felt lost. They felt unequipped. And so moving in with them from a relational perspective, instead of me judging them and going, well, oh, I know why that kid's like that. Of course, instead of responding to that way, I go, look, let's figure this out together. This is daunting and intimidating for anyone and everyone. And, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of kids with ADHD, but I've never worked with your kid with ADHD. So I don't know what's going on either. So let's develop this together. And so it's a gentle, more collaborative approach, being a resource. That's why collaborative practice solutions is so important and so valuable, is because it's a strength-based approach that comes from collaboration. Be respectful in our communication, engage with empathy, make sure that we've got our coach hat on and not our judge hat on. I don't find a lot of purpose for that judge hat. And I try to stay in the coaching mentality as much as I possibly can. Learn about ADHD and all of its practices, help parents find resources and support, and know that these kids will get better when we work as a team, collaboratively, not as just a single person fighting a battle. So I think that's it. There are some websites there I gave you, and Lives in the Balance is another good one. Any questions at this point?
Don't have any
Ben,
in the chat, but again, if anybody would like to unmute and ask a question, we have a couple minutes.
that was fantastic, Ben. Really practical and really a good philosophy for how to approach.
Thank you, Dr. Bowling. I know this is challenging to come up with questions. You're just trying to take in information as quickly as possible. That's the one good thing about trainings on Zoom, is you can listen and take information and use the handouts. So I wasn't expecting a lot of interaction. I've been on that end too. So that's certainly fine. But I just want to make sure if anybody did have a question, that we were able to take a moment or two to answer. All right. Well,
And then
Mark, Dr. Bowling, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'll say on my end that I will be sending out an email tomorrow with kind of some follow-up information about how to apply for your continuing ed credit. There are a few extra slides here on this presentation. I won't run through all of them, but we have some really great opportunities coming up for education from some of our other programs, our Parenting at Mealtime and Playtime, our asthma program, and then these board books that we are hoping to give out for free for our lead program. So when this is posted online, take a look at those, because there really are some great opportunities there, and I'll include them in the email as well. And then to close this out today, I will say thank you again to Dr. Carney for a great presentation, a lot of great information. So we thank him for today, and I hope that the rest of you have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.